Hey guys, today I'm finally posting the video of my workbench build from a little while back. Now, I've wanted a workbench for ages, but I never realised just how much more enjoyable it was going to make, woodworking. If I knew what the difference was going to be like, I would have done this maybe 3 or 4 years ago. It's so much better in every way. Building this bench has really made me enjoy woodworking so much more. The difference is night and day. It's a fairly basic bench, to be honest. It's made from standard structural pine, cost me maybe $200 to complete, and that includes the vise on the side. So the first thing I did was draw up a model in SketchUp, and then I took all the measurements out of that, put it into my layout program, Fit It, and worked out how many lengths of wood that I would need. Then I just went and bought them all. That step probably wasn't necessary, but it meant that I didn't really waste anything. I think I had 2 lengths of wood left over, and they were budgeted as spares, so it worked out pretty well. Whenever I see guys making a slab, they tend to have 20 nice long pipe clamps and a thicknesser or a planer smoothing the wood out first. I have neither a thicknesser nor any clamps. So to build my slab, I ripped down each stick to take off the curved edges, and then I glued and screwed each length to one another, just trying to keep the flat edges aligned as close as I could. It actually worked really well, even though here in the video it looks a little bit hacky. If I was to build this again, I would probably use the same method, to be honest, but I would use more than 3 screws per length of wood. I would also go a little bit slower and check that I've got each length flat against its neighbour. I am quite happy with how it worked out though. Once done, I just rubbed some sawdust on it to soak up the excess glue and let it dry for a day or two. Gluing up the legs was very similar, just easier. I made 3 lengths of doubled up 2x4s. I trimmed them on the table saw to clean up the curves and glue, but I didn't try to square them up on it. The wood was so wet and the blade was fighting against it, so I had to settle for less than perfectly square legs. It really doesn't worry me in the slightest. These 3 lengths were enough to give me the 4 legs and 2 bases. I made a couple of mistakes cutting the tenons on the legs, pretty much because I was rushing. I wanted a tenon on each leg to insert into the base, so I just set it on my sled and cut it to the same depth all the way around. Now obviously my posts weren't square, which means that the tenons weren't centered properly. It's not the end of the world, but I did have to account for it when I cut the mortises. And just to really ram it home that you shouldn't rush, I decided it would be a good idea to simply flip the leg over and cut the shoulders for the top tenons at this time as well, completely forgetting that I was going to make them much larger than the base ones. A stop block on the fence helped make cuts halfway through the sides of each tenon, and then I finished those cuts off with a handsaw.
I thought cutting the mortises might be tough, but I wasn't prepared for just how hard it turned out to be. I can blame my tools not being sharp enough or the wood being super wet, but really the main reason is just that I'm not all that good at chopping them out. After fighting with this first one for some time, I decided to cheat and pull out the jigsaw. I drilled a through hole in each corner and then cut in between. The blade in this jigsaw is quite strong and it has cutters on the tips as well, which meant it could bite right through the wood, even though it wasn't exactly long enough to extend all the way through. So to finish it off, I simply flipped the wood over and completed the cuts. The hole left behind was pretty rough, but I could clean it up with the chisels a lot easier than trying to cut the whole thing out with them. Fortunately, imperfect tenons and imperfect mortises combine to become a fairly snug joint. They're not perfect, they're not show-worthy, but they're certainly strong enough for my purposes.
Once I started working on the tabletop, I pretty much knew that I wasn't going to do it by hand. I was going to use the jigsaw basically. So I drilled out as many holes as I could on each one. And even that was hard, just the wood was just incredibly wet and it was just sticking to the drill bit. It was really hard to get through it. But eventually I drilled enough holes and then got the jigsaw out to basically hack a big massive hole in the middle of it. It looks awful, but then once cleaned up with the chisels, it came out just fine. So the bench is upside down at this time, so that's the top of the bench that you're looking at there. I've got no interest in levelling underneath the slab. I don't see how it helps anything at all. It certainly doesn't upset me to know that it's a little bit rough and bumpy. So I'm just going to leave it like that. This was the first dry fit and I was quite happy with it. Originally the leg braces were going to be sort of mortise and tenoned into the legs. After all the trouble I went through with the top, I figured, nah, there's no way I'm doing that. So I decided just to screw it in. Here, it's just going in just with whatever screws I had on hand. And that was just so that I could get it all together and flip it over. And then I replaced those with proper lag screws later on.
Now, I can act the fool at times, but I like to think that in general, I'm not a complete knucklehead. Unfortunately, this footage does not back up that theory. It's so obvious watching from this angle what is about to go down, but at the time, I was supremely confident that I would stick the landing. I didn't.
Now, just to be clear, even with that disaster of a flip over out there, it hasn't actually damaged the table in any way at all. The bench still worked out really, really well. It's very strong and secure, it's fine. It's probably destroyed the pavers out there, but as for the bench itself, it's just, you'd never know it happened. Except, if you're stupid enough to put it in an actual YouTube video and let people see it.